Have you ever wondered if it's possible to understand the whole of the past, literally, from the beginnings of everything to the present day? Is it possible to tell such a story? If so, what would the story look like? Telling such a large, unified account of the past is what we'll attempt in this course. So, welcome to this course in Big History. Big History assembles accounts of the past from many different disciplines into a single, coherent account of the whole of the past. It starts at the beginning, literally, with the origins of the universe, and it ends today. In fact, it's going to go into the future as well. Now, in this lecture, I'll begin by introducing myself and explaining how I began teaching such a course. I hope by doing that, you'll get some sense of the logic behind Big History. Then we'll look more closely at what Big History is, and we'll also look at some of the problems we face when we attempt it. So what is Big History? How does it differ from conventional history courses? I'll end this lecture by describing the overall structure of the course, and I hope by doing that I can give you a sort of roadmap so you know the main landmarks in this course and where we're going to go with it. It may help you get a better sense of what Big History is if I describe my own path to Big History. My own somewhat confused background is relevant here. When someone says to me, "Where are you from?" I'm frankly never sure of the best answer. This is the problem. My father was English. My mother was American, though she was born in Beijing. My parents married in Izmir in Turkey at the end of the war. I was born in Brooklyn, despite the accent. I lived as a child in Nigeria. I went to school and then university in England. I married in Canada, and I studied in Russia. In fact, I had a fascinating year as a graduate student living in Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, in the Brezhnev years. And that was a wonderful introduction to what seemed at the time during the Cold War a completely different world, a sort of dark side. Then I completed my PhD at Oxford, and I got a job in Sydney, Australia, and there I taught for 25 years before coming to the US in 2001. Now, that mixed background may explain why I've always been uncomfortable with the idea of history as essentially a national story, or the story of particular cultures or particular groups, and always interested in the idea of some sort of global approach to the past. I am perhaps, in some ways, what Stalin might have called a rootless cosmopolitan. And that may be part of the background that explains my interest in a sort of universal history. Now let me try and explain why and how I started teaching Big History. As a graduate student at Oxford, I studied Russian history. Why Russian history? I think it was partly a sort of adolescent romance with the Russian soul. I read Dostoevsky, I read Tolstoy, I fell in love with them, and growing up in England, I thought, this is a completely different world from the one I live in. But also, I had curiosity about Russia as a sort of dark side. Now, this is Russia during the Soviet Union. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis very vividly. I was in England, I was at school, and I remember at the height of the crisis, one evening just as we were all about to go home, one of my friends came up to me, shook my hand, and said goodbye. And I said, what's that all about? And he said, "I'm not sure we're going to see each other again." And that really brought home to me with a real shock what was happening. Here was a moment in which millions of people could die, a lot of human civilization could be wiped out, and it could happen within the next 12 hours. And something else crossed my mind, I remember very vividly. It flicked through my mind the question, are there kids over there, on the other side, who are thinking exactly the same thing? So those are the sort of things that explain my fascination with Russia, a sort of sense of it being a different world. And to understand my own world, I had to understand that world as well. For 25 years, I taught Russian and Soviet history at Macquarie University in Sydney. During the Cold War, teaching about Russia and the Soviet Union seemed very important indeed, because now I was trying to teach my own students something about the other side. And I was trying to teach them that, yes, there were real people there, people like you and me, and they were trying to cope with a real world, but it was a rather different world from the one that we had to cope with. During that time, I did research on the diets of Russian peasants in 19th century Russia. Now, this may sound an odd topic, but I took it up under the influence of the great French historian Fernand Braudel, who was one of the leading figures in the French Annales school of historiography. The Annales school had an immense impact on historians of my generation. One of the things they did was insist on seeing human history in its geographical and ecological context. What Braudel taught was that if you look at the past on different scales, you'll see very different things, and you can see the past in entirely new ways. Let me quote. "The way to study history," says Braudel, "is to view it as a long duration, as what I have called the longue durée." Now, this French phrase, longue durée, would become a sort of catchphrase for historians who admired Braudel. It is not the only way, but it is one which, by itself, can pose all the great problems of social structures, past and present. It is the only language binding history to the present, creating one indivisible whole. So, Braudel showed that if you look at the past at unusually large scales, at the scale of the longue durée, by which he meant things that change on scales of several centuries, rather like geological changes, you find you're looking at things that at smaller scales will seem unchangeable, such as slow changes in landscapes, or changes in what he called material life, how people live, their clothing, their diets, their health. And it was the diets that interested me. Suddenly, he argued, at these large scales, you see an entirely new dimension to history, because you'll see these things, they may seem not to change much at small scales, but at larger scales, they clearly do change, and that changes how you understand other scales. That was a powerful introduction to the basic idea of big history, which is that to get a rounded view of the past, you need to see it at multiple scales. In fact, one of my first articles on big history was called The Longest Durée. And yes, I was thinking about the film. I should add that research into peasant diets was wonderful. It was a lot of fun, very interesting, and it led to some interesting and very enjoyable research on the role of vodka, both in Russian state finances and in the life of ordinary Russians. And I mustn't get diverted into vodka, except to say that it played a huge role, both in the world of the peasantry and in Russian finances. It paid basically for most of the costs of the Russian army. Okay, that's enough on vodka. Now, there was something else that drove me to explore large scales. As a history teacher, I was always concerned about the significance of history. Why was I teaching it? Why should students study it? And I was particularly worried that we always seemed to be teaching bits and pieces of the past, but we never seemed to be teaching the whole thing. So I taught Russia, another colleague taught the USA, or another colleague taught ancient Greece, and so on. But what was it that tied all these separate histories together? This question nagged away at me. And then, in the 1980s, I tackled the problem in the most ambitious way I could imagine, by trying to construct a course that began at the beginning of the universe and ended now. Could it be done? How would you do it? What would such a course look like? When my colleagues agreed to let me teach it, that's when I panicked, because I realized I had no idea of how to do it. I didn't know of any courses like this. We had to make it all up from scratch. I was fortunate enough to find wonderful colleagues, and I began teaching it with a team of lecturers that included astronomers, geologists, biologists, anthropologists, and historians. But none of us knew of any course like this, so we really had to make up the rules as we went along. Now, one of the things we found very quickly was that teaching big history was exhilarating. It was exciting. After all, we were teaching 13 billion years in a 13-week semester. So I could say to my colleagues, how many years do you cover in a week? I cover 1 billion years. Quite frankly, I don't ride motorbikes, but for me, this is as close as I'll ever get to riding a very powerful motorbike very fast along a windy cliffside road. It was exciting. It was exciting for teachers, but it was also exciting for a lot of the students. And I think the reason it was exciting for them in particular was because it raised fundamental questions about the meaning of history and about our place in the cosmos. Now, as a teacher, I believe that young students should be asking those questions and they should be encouraged to pursue them seriously. So one of the things I enjoyed most about the course was that it legitimized their questions. It allowed them to think that these large questions were worth pursuing and there were interesting and sensible things you could say about them. In 1992, I wrote an article on the course, and because I needed a label to describe it, I used the somewhat whimsical label Big History. I was thinking, of course, of the Big Bang. It's not the ideal label. I can think of many reasons why other labels might be better, but it seems to have stuck, and that's why we're going to keep using it. Since I started teaching, I've discovered that the rapidly emerging field of world history is also aiming at a much larger vision of the past. A less tribal vision of the past, if you like. World history really took off in the USA in the 1960s. It was invisible in Australia when I was teaching. But it took off in the States partly as a result of the success of W.H. McNeill's brilliant bestseller, Rise of the West, which appeared in 1963. Now, in the first decade of the 21st century, world history scholarship and teaching are booming in the States. There's a new AP course which is flourishing. There are 2 major journals. There are conferences, and there's a very generous intellectual community which has produced a wonderful, rich body of scholarship in the last 20 years. And while most world history courses begin with the appearance of agriculture, some 10,000 years ago, some go further back, and they start out with the origins of the first human beings. Big history tackles even larger scales. It can be thought of, if you like, as a sort of expansion of the world history approach. So there's a very natural link between the two approaches. Now, I want to look more closely at what big history is. So here's a quick definition. Big history surveys the past at the largest possible scales, and it does so using the best available information from many different disciplines. Now, this project has some consequences that need to be emphasized immediately. First, in this course, we won't try to cover everything. What we're going to be trying to do is to construct a coherent narrative of the past. So we're looking for the through line. We won't try and cover everything. Second, because of the scale on which we look at the past, you should not expect to find in it many of the familiar details, names, and personalities that you'll find in other types of historical teaching and writing. For example, the French Revolution and the Renaissance will barely get a mention. They'll zoom past in a blur. You'll barely see them. Instead, what we're going to see is some less familiar aspects of the past, the sort of things that Fernand Braudel was looking for at the longue durée, at the large scale. We'll be looking, above all, for the very large patterns, the shape of the past. And here's a third implication. Though we touch on many disciplines, we're going to cross many disciplines, this is a genuinely interdisciplinary course, my own expertise is as a historian. There are many expert courses that focus on astronomy or geology, and some of you will have great expertise in some of these fields. But this is not the course in which to learn in intricate detail how DNA works or how fusion reactions occur within stars. What you'll find instead is how the insights of these different disciplines can be woven together into a coherent, unified account of the past at all scales, in which the insights of each discipline can illuminate those of the others. You'll find a coherent story. Now, though it uses modern scientific information, I soon realized that big history is in some important ways similar to traditional creation stories. These also used the best available information in the societies in which they were constructed to create credible stories that gave people a sense of their bearings in space and time. And that was what made them so powerful. They offered maps of space and time within which people could say, that's where I am. And that's why I called my book on big history Maps of Time. But creation stories are not unique. Within all the great religious and cultural traditions, you'll find maps of this type. People have tried to understand human history as part of the larger story of the whole universe within all these traditions. This, for example, was the aim of Christian writers such as Augustine, who early in the 5th century helped create a universal history that began about 6,000 years ago, which was when he assumed, or calculated rather, that God had created the earth. And that story would shape Christian historiography for over 1,000 years. What Augustine's story did was to embed the history of humanity, the city of man, in the history of the universe, the divine world, the city of God. In fact, historians have attempted universal histories in all eras. Over time, I've realized that the project of big history is not really that original. H.G. Wells' Outline of History, which was published just after World War I, is perhaps the most famous 20th century attempt. Wells wrote the book because of his horror at what was happening during World War I. And he found, when he looked at the historians, that far from helping humanity avoid such crises in the future, the historians were part of the problem, because each of them presented a sort of tribal myth that encouraged tribalism and conflict. So there were the historians of Germany, the historians of Britain, the historians of Russia. Could one find a larger story that might encourage a sense of unity between humans? That's what H.G. Wells was looking for. And his idea was that you'd find such a larger story if you attempted to create a unified history that embedded human history in larger histories. Unfortunately, a lot of the science that makes big history possible now, including all the dating techniques that allow us now to put absolute dates on events in the remote past, wasn't available when he wrote. Since his time, big history has become possible in a way it was not before, because of a whole series of scientific breakthroughs in the middle of the 20th century. So it's possible now in a way that it wasn't before, and yet oddly, universal histories have been quite unfashionable in recent decades. Modern education focuses almost exclusively on specialized knowledge. For example, most history teaching and scholarship is concerned with just the last 2,000 years, and most of that with the last 300 or 400 years. And very few historians work closely with biologists or geologists or astronomers. And the result is a fragmented vision of reality. And that's what we seem to teach in most of our schools and universities. A vision of reality in which you get a bit of chemistry, a bit of history, a bit of this, a bit of that, but no coherence. Now, this fragmented vision of reality that we teach in the modern world is profoundly unsatisfying. The problem and its solution are described very well in a book that a physicist wrote in 1944 about the origins of life. The physicist was Erwin Schrödinger. His dates are 1887 to 1961. He wrote a book on the origins of life after giving a series of lectures on the subject in Dublin in 1943. Now, he was acutely aware that he was a physicist. He was one of the pioneers of quantum physics. But he was not really qualified to write a book on life. Yet, he argued, a unified understanding of reality was vital, and that required that scholars be prepared to cross disciplines. So, if no one else would do it, let me quote Schrödinger. He puts it very well. We have inherited from our forefathers the keen longing for unified, all-embracing knowledge. The very name given to the highest institutions of learning reminds us that from antiquity and throughout many centuries, the universal aspect has been the only one to be given full credit. But the spread, both in width and depth, of the multifarious branches of knowledge during the last 100-odd years has confronted us with a queer dilemma. We feel clearly that we are only now beginning to acquire reliable material for welding together the sum total of all that is known into a whole. But on the other hand, it has become next to impossible for a single mind fully to command more than a small, specialized portion of it. And he concludes, I can see no other escape from this dilemma than that some of us should venture to embark on a synthesis of facts and theories, albeit with second-hand and incomplete knowledge of some of them, and at the risk of making fools of ourselves. So much, he writes, for my apology, and all I can say to that is, Amen. So big history tries to meet the need that Schrödinger identified for a more unified account of reality. But let me remind you that this is one attempt to tell the story. In the future, we can imagine many different approaches with different emphases. We can imagine biologists' versions, we can imagine geologists' versions, we can imagine astronomers' versions. And they may tell the same essential story, but they'll differ in important ways. So this is one account. Okay, so much by way of discussing what big history is. Now what I want to do in the last part of this lecture is give you a roadmap of where we're going. In this course, we'll survey modern scientific accounts of the origins of our universe, our Earth, the biosphere, and human society. This is, as I've said, a historian's version. There are also versions taught by astronomers and geologists. But in some way, historians are peculiarly well placed to weave together such a story, because they're used to dealing with extraordinarily complex phenomena, such as human societies, that can't be handled with a few beautiful equations, and they're also trained to weave stories from the complex details of the past. Because I'm a historian, I'll avoid most scientific technicalities. For example, I'll introduce only one mathematical equation, that's E equals mc squared, and it's going to appear in this course largely for symbolic reasons. The course's central theme, which I owe in part to the work of Eric Chaisson, an astronomer who's taught an astronomer's version of big history in Boston for many years, the central theme is the appearance of increasingly complex entities in the universe. So our course will be structured around 8 fundamental thresholds. Each of them is associated with new forms of complexity, each of which has new emergent properties. Now, we'll discuss the idea of complexity and emergent properties more fully in Lecture 3. So these 8 thresholds will provide the scaffolding for this course. Let me go through them. The first is the creation of the universe, Threshold 1, about 13.7 billion years ago. That's a subject normally discussed within cosmology. Lectures 5 to 6 will cover this. Let me say that in the written materials that accompany this course, you'll find 8 timelines at different scales. And I think you'll find it helpful to go back over and over again to those timelines to get a clear sense of the unfamiliar chronology of this course. So that's the first threshold, the creation of the universe, 13.7 billion years ago. The second is the creation of the first complex objects, stars. The first stars appeared more than 12 billion years ago, quite soon after the creation of the universe. They provide the energy and the raw materials for later forms of complexity. That's Lecture 7. Threshold 3 is the creation inside dying stars of the chemical elements that allowed the creation of chemically complex entities, including planets and including you and me. That's Lecture 8. The next threshold, which we cover in Lectures 9 to 11, is the creation of our Earth. And what we look at in that section is the creation of solar systems. Now, these are objects that are chemically significantly more complex than stars. So that's why this is a new level of complexity. Our Earth was created as a byproduct of the creation of our Sun and solar system about 4.5 billion years ago. This group of lectures also surveys the history of our home planet, and we're in the territory of geologists. Threshold 5 is the creation and evolution of life on Earth. The first evidence of life comes from about 3.8 billion years ago on this planet. Now, the creation of life is a threshold that may also have been crossed many times, billions of times before, in other parts of the universe. But as yet, we have no firm evidence that this is true. Life, so far, we can only study on our one planet. This group of lectures will also survey the evolution of our own ancestors, the hominines, from about 6 million years ago. Then we come to threshold 6. By threshold 6, we're now just 250,000 years ago. We've now covered most of 13 billion years, and we're reaching the present moment. Threshold 6 is the creation of our own species, Homo sapiens, about 250,000 years ago. This section of the course discusses what makes us so distinctive. It argues that we have a capacity to adapt and to change that is unprecedented amongst other organisms on Earth. We also cover the Paleolithic era of human history, the oldest, the longest, but also the least well-documented part of our history. The Paleolithic era lasts until the appearance of agriculture 10 to 11,000 years ago. Then we come to threshold 7 in lectures 24 to 37, the largest single group of lectures in this course. Threshold 7 is the emergence of agriculture and agricultural societies from about 11,000 years ago. And it introduces what I'll call the agrarian era of human history, the second of 3 major eras of human history. Agriculture marked a fundamental change in human history because what it did was accelerate the pace of change. It allowed population growth, the emergence of larger, denser, and eventually more complex societies, including the great agrarian civilizations, such as the Roman Empire or the great empires of China. And finally, we come to threshold 8, the modern revolution. And this introduces the modern era of human history. In this part of the course, we'll cover the astonishing series of transformations that have created today's unified, complex world in just a few centuries, 3 or 4 centuries. Then what we'll do is widen the lens again. In the last 3 lectures, we'll look at the future. We'll look at the future of humans, of the Earth, and eventually of the universe as a whole. What's going to happen to the universe? And we'll end with an overview of the entire course. Now, let me end by telling you what I regard as some of the crucial objectives of this course. Here's the first. I hope you'll find this huge journey exhilarating. And I hope it will provide a chance for you to think deeply about the place of human beings and modern society in the larger scheme of things. You won't always agree with my assessment of this, but I hope it'll give you a chance to think rigorously and seriously about these issues. Secondly, a second objective that I have in mind. I hope you'll gain a clear understanding of the overall shape of what I'm tempted to call a modern scientific creation story, and an understanding of why this story is both important and in some ways very beautiful. Third, I hope by the end of this course you will also have a much better sense of the underlying unity of modern knowledge. And you'll see that behind the fragmented vision of reality that modern educational systems offer, there is in fact a unified account offered by modern science of reality and its evolution. So, in summary, I've tried in this lecture to explain what big history is. It's an account of the past at all possible scales. The next lecture will focus on the unifying idea of multiple scales. How big is the universe? How old is it? And perhaps most important of all, how can we possibly get our minds around these huge scales? Thank you. Have you ever wondered if it's possible to understand the whole of the past, literally, from the beginnings of everything to the present day? Is it possible to tell such a story? If so, what would the story look like? Telling such a large, unified account of the past is what we'll attempt in this course. So, welcome to this course in Big History. Big History assembles accounts of the past from many different disciplines into a single, coherent account of the whole of the past. It starts at the beginning, literally, with the origins of the universe, and it ends today. In fact, it's going to go into the future as well. Now, in this lecture, I'll begin by introducing myself and explaining how I began teaching such a course. I hope by doing that, you'll get some sense of the logic behind Big History. Then we'll look more closely at what Big History is, and we'll also look at some of the problems we face when we attempt it. So what is Big History? How does it differ from conventional history courses? I'll end this lecture by describing the overall structure of the course, and I hope by doing that I can give you a sort of roadmap so you know the main landmarks in this course and where we're going to go with it. It may help you get a better sense of what Big History is if I describe my own path to today's St. Petersburg in the Brezhnev years. And that was a wonderful introduction to what seemed at the time during the Cold War a completely different world, a sort of dark side. Then I completed my PhD at Oxford, and I got a job in Sydney, Australia, and there I taught for 25 years before coming to the US in 2001. Now, that mixed background may explain why I've always been uncomfortable with the idea of history as essentially a national story, or the story of particular cultures or particular groups, and always interested in the idea of some sort of global approach to the past. History. My own somewhat confused background is relevant here. When someone says to me, "Where are you from?" I'm frankly never sure of the best answer. This is the problem. My father was English. My mother was American, though she was born in Beijing. My parents married in Izmir in Turkey at the end of the war. I was born in Brooklyn, despite the accent. I lived as a child in Nigeria. I went to school and then university in England. I married in Canada, and I studied in Russia. In fact, I had a fascinating year as a graduate student living in Leningrad